Mississippi. In the heart of the 19th century cotton fields, endless stretches of white reached toward the horizon. Yet beneath that gleaming surface lay sweat, blood, and a heavy silence. Overseers' whips cracked through the air like storms, striking over bent backs that measured time in pain. Among the laborers stood Ned, quiet for years, scars etched across his skin like a secret diary. Tonight, he did not know if he would survive, but he knew one thing. If that whip came down again, it would not return to its master's hand. The field spread wider than the eye could see, a living sea of white cotton swaying in the late summer. Heat. To outsiders it might have seemed beautiful, like snow drifting across the Mississippi countryside. But for those bent under the sun, there was nothing beautiful here. Each tuft of cotton pricked like a thorn, each stalk another demand on a body already pushed to the limit. Ned's fingers moved almost automatically, plucking cotton and stuffing it into his sack, the canvas rubbing raw against his shoulders. He did not flinch. Pain was a language he had long stopped speaking. Around him, men and women moved in quiet unison, their backs arched like broken branches, breaths shallow and measured. Time did not follow the clock. It followed the overseer's commands, and the weight of cotton tallied at dusk. The sun beat down on every exposed inch of skin, sweat stung eyes, and dust hung thick in the air. The harvest promised wealth, but never for those who labored. For Ned and the others, it meant longer hours, fewer breaks, and the ever-present threat of the lash. He glanced at a boy 2 rows down, barely older than a child, struggling with a sack too heavy for his shoulders. His lips were cracked, movements slow. Ned looked away before the overseer noticed. Compassion was dangerous under watchful eyes. A whip snapped behind him, sharp as lightning. A woman stumbled, spilling cotton into the dirt. The overseer's voice snarled like a dog. "Pick it up faster." Trembling, her hands gathered the cotton, red staining her palms. Ned bent lower, keeping his pace. Each strike against another back echoed inside his own. His scars spoke louder than words ever could. The overseer believed silence meant submission, but silence was also vigilance, patience, the quiet guarding of something untouchable. The fields held more than cotton. They held the invisible fire of people pushed past their limits. Each drop of blood soaked into the soil, staining roots that would never tell the truth. From afar, cotton looked pure. Ned knew better. It was a crop grown in sweat, nourished by pain, and harvested under constant threat. As the sun dipped, casting long shadows over the rows, Ned lifted his eyes from the plants. For a fleeting moment, he stared at the horizon. The world seemed endless, yet his life remained trapped within these borders. Still, something in that sky whispered of freedom, faint, but alive. The overseer's presence bent the field. He carried nothing but a coiled whip at his side. To him, the whip was language. Each crack a command, each welt a period, each scream an exclamation. His name barely mattered. On the plantation, he was remembered not as a man, but as a merciless shadow. A broad hat shaded his pale face, boots pressing deep into the soil, leaving marks that seemed to brand the ground itself. Conversations halted when he appeared. Even the wind seemed to pause. Ned had felt the lash more times than he could count, some for slow work, some for standing too straight, some for no reason at all. Scars ran across his back like pale ridges, carrying memory without voice. He never cried out. His silence infuriated the overseer, who demanded fear to be made visible. Ned gave him nothing. At night, returning to the cabin, shirt clinging to raw skin, he traced one scar with his fingertip. Each line was an unspoken inscription on a tombstone yet to be raised. The overseer had tried to write his name across Ned's body, but Ned refused to let those marks define him. The overseer ruled not only with force but with spectacle. Beatings were carried out in full view of the field hands, a grim performance meant to teach, through terror, the cost of defiance. Children learned the nature of power not from sermons, but from screams. Women bent over cotton with eyes downcast, silently praying not to draw attention. Men stooped lower, carrying not just sacks of cotton, but the weight of humiliation itself. Yet power is fragile, built on the illusion of invulnerability. The overseer believed himself untouchable. He thought every man and woman in the field had been broken into silence. That fear would always outweigh courage. But Ned watched him carefully, more than the overseer suspected. He noted the pattern of patrols, the moments when the whip rested idle, the arrogance that made him believe he was safe. Every scar on Ned's back was a silent entry in an unspoken ledger, a ledger growing heavier by the day. In the overseer's shadow, life was measured by lashes. But shadows stretch as the sun lowers, and Ned, though quiet, was already calculating something the overseer had never considered: the precise moment when silence would snap. Night on the plantation brought no rest. It brought whispers, carried cautiously through thin wooden walls, a chorus of fears stifled before they could take form. The cabins sat close together, rows of weathered timber smelling of smoke and sweat. Inside, silence weighed heavier than chains. Ned sat in the corner, the dying fire casting flickering shadows across his face. A few men murmured softly, words cut short by creaking floorboards or shifting wind. Freedom of speech was a luxury no one could afford. The overseer's ears seemed to extend into the night. Punishment could arrive at dawn. Walls offered little protection. Ned's hand traced the ridges on his back. The scars were maps, not of places, but of survival. Each welt marked a moment when he had wanted to cry out, yet remained silent. Silence had preserved his life. It had let him hold something no whip could touch. But it carried its own weight, pressing on his chest, making each breath shallow, stretching the nights unbearably long. Outside, cicadas sang without pause, their relentless hum like a warning. Ned's eyes fixed on the gap in the planks where moonlight seeped through. Beyond that fragile barrier, the world waited. He wondered if it would ever open for him, or if he would die trapped behind walls steeped in smoke and fear. In another corner, an old man whispered a prayer so faint it blended with the wind. A woman rocked her child, humming softly, weaving a fragile cocoon of calm in a place where calm rarely lasted. The air itself was heavy with fragile, as if one wrong word could shatter it completely. Ned's thoughts drifted back to the boy in the field, the way he struggled under the weight of the sack, the whip slicing through the air, the sound of it tearing flesh. The image replayed in his mind like a flickering flame in a pile of ash. Each time it came, something stirred deep within him. Not rage, not yet, but a spark, small and hidden, yet alive. Silence had long been his shield. Now it felt like a cage. He understood that silence could protect, but it could also suffocate. In the dim cabin, moonlight spilling across the dirt floor, Ned felt a shift. Small, subtle as the tremor of a leaf in the wind, but unmistakable. He was no longer willing to remain silent. The weight pressed too heavily. The ledger of scars was full. Deep inside, an ember of defiance glowed. The next day, the sun rose merciless, pouring fire across the horizon. Harvest season was at its peak, and with it, the demands intensified. Overseers barked orders. Whips cracked louder and more frequently than ever. Cotton had to be gathered before storms, before rot, before the market window closed. The burden fell not on the plantation owners, but on bent backs in the fields. Heat shimmered in the air. Cotton tore at already raw fingers. Shirts clung to sweat-soaked bodies, salt-stinging wounds that had never healed. Dust and exhaustion rose from the earth. Time dragged, measured only by the overseer's voice. Faster, faster. Every second stretched into an eternity of labor. Ned moved with the others, but today felt different. His body strained under fatigue, yet his eyes no longer remained fixed on the ground. For years he had kept his gaze low, invisible, safe. But the relentless heat, the lash of the whip, the unending demands, they pulled his eyes upward, toward the sky he had long avoided. Above him, the sky stretched vast, cloudless, merciless. Yet in its expanse, Ned felt something unfamiliar, not despair but clarity. If mercy did not exist here, perhaps it had to be created. The overseer's voice roared again. A whip cracked, not at Ned this time, but close enough to burn in his ears. He did not flinch. Shoulders rose, chest expanded, and for the first time in years he breathed fully. The scorching air filled him not with pain, but with strength. Around him, the rhythm of the field continued, sacks filling, bodies sagging. But Ned's rhythm shifted. His hands still moved, but his mind lingered on the scars, on the silence, on the ember he had felt the night before. He could almost hear it now, crackling faintly beneath the roar of commands. As the day dragged on, the sun sank lower, yet the heat remained relentless. Bodies collapsed, dragged upright again. Whips snapped, curses flew. Amid the haze of sweat and dust, Ned lifted his head again, eyes fixed not on cotton or the dirt, but on the horizon. For the first time he refused to look down. In that simple act, invisible to most, something irreversible began. The sky grew, heavy, clouds rolling across the fields, though the sun had not yet set. The air thickened, pressing on lungs as if even the heavens were holding their breath. Every worker felt it. Cotton still needed to be picked, sacks still to be filled, but something in the atmosphere made the simple act of bending and plucking unbearable. The overseer prowled like a wolf, boots pounding the soil, whip twitching in his hand. He barked at the older men, spat, and insults flew at the women. Whips lashed the backs of those who faltered. The cotton field, once a place of endless labor, had become a theater of cruelty. Ned kept his hands moving, though pain screamed through his shoulders. His eyes lingered on the boy beside him, a boy whose face was still soft, curls brushing his temples, struggling under a sack nearly dragging him to the ground. The overseer had noticed as well. He stalked forward, whip coiling in his hand. The boy dropped a single bowl of cotton and froze. That was enough. The overseer's shadow fell over him, voice sharp and furious. "Pick it up faster, you worthless dog." The boy's hands shook as he scrambled, but the whip was already in motion. The crack split the field like lightning. The boy gasped, scattering cotton across the dirt. Blood bloomed among the white tufts, violent and raw, louder than any scream. Ned stiffened. His hands stopped. Something tore inside him, not flesh, but the long-kept silence within. For years he had endured, watched, and bent under pain that was never his alone. Now, seeing the boy broken, the string that had bound him snapped. His chest rose and fell like a storm gathering. His eyes, trained for so long to stay low, fixed on the overseer. The field stilled. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Above, clouds thickened, and a hawk circled far off, wings stretched wide. Ned's hands trembled, not from fear, but from something heavier, sharper, unstoppable. The boy whimpered beside him as the overseer lifted the whip again, eager for another strike. Ned felt his muscles coil, taut as a drawn bow. The world narrowed to a single line, the whip in the overseer's hand and the fire in his chest. The moment had arrived. Years of silence could no longer contain the sound waiting to be born. The whip arched downward, the motion he had seen countless times before. But this time, the pattern broke. Ned's hand shot to the steel handle of his cotton-picking knife, not a weapon of war, only a tool, but in that instant, it became something else entirely. There was no plan, no signal, no whispered agreement. It happened as naturally as a breath after drowning. The blade left his side in a blur and the air seemed to shatter. A new sound erupted, not the whip's crack but a deep, raw noise, a cry folding into silence. Workers froze mid-motion, clutching cotton that suddenly felt impossibly heavy. The overseer staggered, voice cut short. The whip slipped from his hand, falling soundlessly into the dirt. Dust swirled around his boots, then stilled. The field held its breath. Even cicadas paused as if the natural world itself recoiled. Ned stood, chest heaving, knife still clenched. His eyes burned, not with triumph, but with raw release. Defiance, the first taste of a voice long buried. No one moved. Men and women who had only known submission stared, seeing him as if for the first time. Some trembled, others held their breath, yet all understood what had just occurred. The cotton swayed gently in the breeze, brushing knees and ankles, whispering like 1,000 witnesses. Near the overseer's feet, a patch of white bore the faint mark of red, staining innocence with truth. Ned's gaze shifted to the boy, still crouched, eyes wide with disbelief. For the first time, Ned bent, not to the cotton, but to another human. He helped the boy to his feet, steadying him with hands strong as iron. The overseer lay still. The whip was gone. Power had shifted, however briefly, however dangerously. In that moment, with every worker watching, Ned stood taller than he had in all his years. His silence had ended, not in words, but in action. The field would never forget the sound it had witnessed. That day, the field did not hear a scream nor a command. It heard a fracture, clean, final, irreversible. The moment hung in the air like a storm refusing to break. Every worker froze, sacks half filled, hands suspended above the cotton. The overseer's body slumped to the ground, the whip lying lifeless beside him. A silence deeper than night pressed down on every chest. Ned stood in the center, chest heaving, knife still clenched so tightly his knuckles had whitened. His breath roared in his ears, louder than cicadas, louder than the wind stirring the cotton. For years he had kept his head bowed, his voice locked away. Now he stood taller than ever, eyes burning, shoulders squared. The boy beside him trembled, staring first at the fallen overseer, then at Ned. Slowly Ned reached out, steadying the boy with a firm hand on his shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it carried everything. Reassurance, courage, defiance. Around them, others lifted their heads, eyes wide with fear, but also with understanding. They saw not only what had happened, but what it meant. For the first time, someone had broken the unbreakable. The overseer's shadow no longer ruled the field, and yet the silence remained heavy. It was not celebration, yet. Everyone knew the cost of defiance. They knew how quickly word would spread, how swiftly the owners would retaliate. Ned's act was a spark, and sparks could ignite everything, sparing none who struck the match. The cotton swayed, whispering like a witness. White fields had drunk blood before, but never like this. The earth itself seemed to remember, etching the moment into soil and root. Ned dropped the knife into the dirt, lifted his chin, eyes sweeping across the field. No words were needed. His silence spoke more than speech ever could. He was no longer bent, no longer broken. For this brief, suspended moment, he stood as a man. The whip lay abandoned. The overseer's shadow was gone. What replaced it was fragile, trembling, yet real. The image of a man reclaiming his dignity in open air. The spell broke with a distant dog bark. The world resumed motion, and with it came consequences. Word spread like wildfire. By dusk, whispers had traveled from the cotton rows to the big house, from the cabins to the nearest town. The overseer was dead. Ned, the quiet one, the voiceless one, was the man who had done it. The hunt began before night fell fully. Riders mounted with lanterns, dogs poured into the fields. The owners knew rebellion must be crushed swiftly before courage could spread. Ned ran through the cotton rows, across muddy paths, into the dense marshlands bordering the plantation. His feet pounded the earth, breath tearing through his chest. Behind him, dogs howled, men shouted, lanterns bobbing like angry fireflies in the dark. The swamp swallowed him in shadows. Mud clung to his legs, water splashed against his knees. He pressed forward, guided only by instinct and the need to keep moving. Each footprint sank deep, evidence left behind, but there was no choice. Reeds rattled, frogs croaked, night thickened around him. Every step was a battle. He stumbled, caught himself, stumbled again. The weight of silence no longer pressed on him. It had been replaced by the weight of pursuit. He ran for the boy he had saved, for every pair of eyes that had watched him stand tall. Behind him, voices grew louder. The hunters fanned out, dogs sniffing the ground, splashing through water. Ned pushed deeper into the marsh, chest rising and falling like thunder. Vines scratched him, branches tore at his skin, blood mixed with sweat. For a moment the swamp seemed endless, a labyrinth of darkness and water that might hide him forever. He dared to hope, dared to believe he could vanish into the wilderness, become a ghost the plantation could never reclaim. But hope is fragile. The dogs closed in. Torches flared through the trees, men shouting, boots slapping wet ground, closing the circle. Ned turned once, breath sharp in his throat, and saw it, lanterns glowing from every direction, reflected in the water like cruel stars. Nowhere left to run. His chest heaved, hands clenched, but his eyes burned steady. They could chase his body, but they could not catch his defiance. When men surged forward, seizing him, dragging him to the ground, Ned did not cry out. He met the night with silence, the same silence that had been his shield, now his final weapon. Morning came cold and gray, a sky offering no comfort. Ned was dragged into town, wrists bound, clothes torn from the marsh chase, dirt streaked across his bruised body. Yet his back remained straight. He did not lower his gaze as townsfolk crowded the streets, whispers rippling, some horrified, some curious, some secretly awed. The courthouse was small, wooden walls echoing footsteps as guards shoved him inside. Men in coats and polished boots presided over the bench, voices crisp, verdict already written before trial began. Proceedings were swift, witnesses were called, words twisted into condemnation. The boy Ned had saved was nowhere to be seen. No one from the fields was allowed to speak. Ned himself was not asked to explain, confess, or deny. His silence, once his refuge, was now interpreted as guilt. The prosecutor's voice rang out like a sermon. This man by his hand has destroyed order. By his example, he threatens the very foundation of our society. His act cannot be forgiven, cannot be excused. The sentence must be death, and it must be public. The gavel struck wood, sharp, final and unyielding, yielding. Ned was sentenced to hang at dawn. As the room emptied, he remained standing, chains cold against his wrists. Guards hauled him away, shoving him into a damp stone cell, the air thick with the scent of iron and mildew. He sank to the wooden floor, back against the wall, eyes fixed on the small square of sky visible through the barred window. His mind wandered, not to fear, but to memory. He saw the boy in the field, blood dripping onto cotton. He saw the whip fall, the silence fracture, the field holding its breath. He knew his fate, yet he also knew something the court could not. Silence could be broken, and once broken, it could never be undone. When dawn arrived, the square brimmed with people. A scaffold loomed tall against the pale sky, ropes swaying in the wind. The crowd gathered, hungry for spectacle, for reassurance that order would prevail. Ned walked forward, unflinching. Steps steady, shoulders squared. He carried no words, no plea. His silence was his final act of defiance, and in that silence he spoke louder than the jeers around him. The noose tightened. The world paused. When the trapdoor opened, the silence thundered, louder than any crack of the overseer's whip, louder than any shout the fields had ever known. Years passed. The plantation's cotton fields continued to bloom white each season, but the soil remembered more than cotton. It remembered footsteps pounding through the rows, blood soaking into the dirt, a silence once shattered like glass. Overseers changed, whips cracked again, but the story of Ned persisted in whispers among those who still bent low beneath the sun. He was not called a hero. They were too cautious for such a word. But he was remembered as a man who had stood when no one else could, who lifted his head and disrupted the rhythm of obedience. To some, his act seemed madness. To others, it was proof that courage could survive even in chains. Children grew up hearing fragments of his name, warned never to speak it aloud. His deed was a forbidden memory. Yet memory finds a way to endure, in songs, in prayers, in the pauses between words. Ned became more than a man. He became a question. Was he guilty of murder, as the court claimed, Or guilty only of reclaiming what had been stolen? His voice, his dignity, his humanity? The answer shifted depending on who asked, but the question itself endured. The fields of Mississippi bore witness long after the men with whips were gone. Cotton still swayed white against the sky, yet some could see red beneath the stalks, imagining the silence that once roared louder than any shout. History did not etch Ned's name in books, which preferred kings, generals, and owners. But names, like his, live in other ways, in the courage of those who heard, in the defiance of those who remembered. His story traveled not on paper, but on breath. And now, when it is told, we return him to the world he was denied. His silence, once forced upon him, became a voice that still echoes. In every question of justice, every cry against cruelty, every reminder that a single act of defiance can shift the weight of an entire field. Ned's life ended on the gallows, but his story did not. It lives in the soil, in the scars of memory, in the whisper of cotton in the wind. And so we ask, was it a crime, or was it freedom, destruction, or the first breath of dignity? Stories like Ned's endure. They breathe in us when we speak them aloud.